Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So now it's time to talk about another one of those cool big picture, what's going on out there ideas. So again, we've learned a lot about the principles of behavior, but and they're going to help us constrain ourselves to being able to ask these big picture questions. So how do we talk about choice, right? It's a daily phenomenon, something we all experience every day. And this brings into question one of the assumptions of behavior analysis. Well, in the sense that we abide by determinism, right? So it's an assumption that we make that everything is lawful and orderly. The reason things happen is not because of some mysterious force driven from inside of us or from some kind of alternative dimension. It's all orderly processes, right? Environment, behavior, relations, behavior makes sense. So in day-to-day life, we often use this word free will and choice, right? They're two terms that seem to be tied together, often talked about, right? Because free will is that the idea of volition, right? You do things because you want to. Carlos, why is he chewing gum? Because he wanted to, right? He had a choice. He could have drank water. He could have went to run a marathon, but no, what did he do? He made a choice, chewing gum. So how can we start wrapping our heads around what in the world choice is from a behavioral analytics standpoint? So the first thing you want to do whenever we want to use our framework to ask these big picture questions is first stick to Carlos's motto. What behavior are we looking at? One of the most important questions you always want to ask. So let's look at these scenarios. On the left, you have a picture of a guy who's falling asleep by his bed, probably cramming for a midterm or a final, right? So you have all kinds of possible options for him to engage in. You have his computer where he can get on social media, or he can get on games, or he can study material for his class. He has his phone, which is another means to access a lot of those same reinforcers. And you can also contact people. You have food, right? You have pizza and chocolate. You can consume them whenever you want. So you have books, right, to study, but yet he's asleep. So amongst all the choices, how do you make a choice of what to do? Okay, and then on the right side, we have a picture of a bunch of people at a bar having some drinks, enjoying each other's company, right? They're all good friends. They like hanging out to each other. So why do they hang out with those specific people rather than other people, right? How does that work? Do these scenarios have anything in common? So what does procrastination look like, right? What does the behavior look like, as Carlos always says? What does friendship always look like? So procrastination, you're basically saying that you are engaging in lots of different behaviors instead of the one you should be engaging in, right? Friendship. I and Carlos have been friends for a long time. We are always hanging out together, but yet we don't really hang out with people that live 2 hours away that we know, right? So why is that a thing? So do these examples have anything in common when we look at them this way? I'm not sure. What do you guys think? So let's think about these choice examples in terms of the ABCs of behavior, right? The antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So when we look at procrastination, you're spending a lot of time in your apartment right now, right, with the coronavirus epidemic actually out there in the world. You have choices of how to spend your time in your apartment. Friendship. You have a handful of close friends. You tend to talk to some more than compared to others. So what does the three-term contingency for procrastination look like? So the behavior, engage in homework, consequence, you're done early. Antecedents is that you have that impending due date, right? But then what about the Rockets game, right? So here you have probably two antecedents. One, the Rockets game is on TV. The second one is that you still have that deadline, but instead, I'm going to hang out with Carlos and watch the Rockets game because they're the best team in the league, and they're fun to watch, okay? So then we also have the other example, right? Friendship. So let's say that I'm hanging out with Thomas. He talks about a few behavioral topics. It's my behavior, so I want to talk to him about behavior. He doesn't respond very well to it, right? He's like, dude, why do you always want to talk about behavior? Then I talk to Carlos. He's always down to talk about behavior. So that's how we spend a lot of our time, right? And he reinforces my behavior of talking to him about behavior. So now what we are going to do is we need to put on our radical behavior glasses, right? And what radical behaviorism is, we'll talk about a little bit more when we talk about the theory of behavior analysis. But basically, we want to view the world like a behavior analyst. So our goal is you need to find the like in the unlike, right? So just like in the examples we talked about, they're two different scenarios that seem different. So do they have anything in common? What do those things share, right? So it seems that both situations involve a choice where we can implement this ABCs, the operant paradigm, right? So it's one way to start looking at, okay, there's a couple of behaviors that I can engage in, and there's also alternative sources of reinforcement that I can engage in, right? So that's something to keep in mind. So our goal in behavior analysis is always to understand, predict, and change behavior, right? So you have to look at all the contingencies that are operating. So it's starting to get at this idea of several responses and reinforcement alternatives. So what are we talking about? How can we bring the principles of behavior to bear on these situations? How can we make sense out of these and identify the like in the unlike? So does anyone remember what a concurrent schedule is, right? So we've learned that with scheduled reinforcement, how you deliver reinforcement changes how frequently someone engages in the behavior, right? Produces orderly changes and orderly patterns. So with a concurrent schedule, we're saying we have two little schedules that are independent, that are operating at the same time. Remember, the organism, right now, I am free to do whatever I want, right? I can continue giving this lecture, I can talk to him, I can go do some work, or I can go out and play basketball, right? So I have several alternative behaviors that I can engage in. So you got to remember, right? What we're interested in right now, the like and the unlike in those situations, is that the organism seems to be distributing their time between behavior, different behaviors. And maybe that's how we can start looking at this concept of choice or preference. So if you consider that all those factors are equal, right? Contingencies, how much reinforcement is available, you might tend to spend more time and energy on alternatives that provide more reinforcement, right? That would make sense. So we can start grasping this idea of choice and talking about it as a behavior. So we're likely to engage in a behavior that has been frequently reinforced. Yeah. So let's talk about this guy. So his name is Howard Rachlin, right? He was a big behavior analyst, and he had some questions, right? And as always, a lot of these early behavior analysts were like, let's ask these questions in the operant chamber where we can control the environment and start to make sense out of these phenomena. So what he did, he set up an operant chamber scenario where he had a concurrent schedule operating. He had a variable interval 25-second schedule and a variable interval 5-second schedule. And remember, with variable interval schedules, the participant doesn't know precisely when reinforcement will occur, and the contingency is placed on the amount of time that has elapsed, and then the first behavior to occur after is what is reinforced. So then the pigeon has a question. Which one do I want to press? How do you think they would allocate their time, right? Is VI 5-second going to lead to more reinforcement than a VI 25 seconds? What do you guys think? So this is what Howard Rachlin ended up finding. Okay, so we're going to look at this table and see his results. What he saw is that the pigeon started proportionally allocating its responding due to the proportional rates of reinforcement. So some big words. What in the world does that mean? What do you think it means, Carlos?
In summary, what this means is that whenever you have two or more different behaviors that you can engage in, most likely you're going to engage in the behavior that reinforces you the most or has a longer history of reinforcement. Going back to this specific slide, in the VI 5 seconds, so this means on average, every 5 seconds, the pigeon's going to get food. And on this one, on average, every 25 seconds, the pigeon's going to get food. So he's going to get a lot more food coming from this specific schedule. So given these two, if you give him a choice per se, the pigeon's going to allocate the responding to this specific lever, right? Just because it produces more reinforcement. And that's what they found in those different studies.
Exactly. So now let's look at this top part of the graph, all right, to the table, right? So we have a VI3, two VI3 3-minute schedules, okay? So let's see. The reinforcement should, in theory, be half and half, right? 50% per response. Now let's look at the responding, right? So I said that backwards. Responses were distributed 50% of the time, and it turns out that the reinforcement forthcoming was distributed evenly, right? 50% on one lever, 50% on the other. So now let's look when we start to change and manipulate those variables, right? So VI 9 minute compared to a VI 1.8 minute. Which one's going to probably produce more reinforcement? So what Howard, Racklin, and Ernstine found is that with the VI 1.8 compared to the 9, the participant is more likely to engage in the VI 1.8 compared to the VI 9. And the reinforcement frequency was actually related to that, to the relative rate of responses, right? So this is kind of what we mean by the proportional rate in responding.
Yeah, because what you see here is that wherever there's less responding, there's less reinforcement. Wherever there's more responding, there's more reinforcement. So it's that correlation, right? Where you're going to have more, the more reinforcement you have for a specific behavior, you're probably going to choose that specific behavior to engage in a lot more than when you have less reinforcement.
Exactly. So one cool thing that came out of this is this whole concept of the matching law. So basically, this is an equation created by behavior analysts to try to bring quantitative analysis to the science, right? So basically what that means, they were trying to find an equation that described the relationship between the relative response rates and the relative rates of reinforcement. So the idea of, in theory, the more I behave and the more reinforcement that I provided, more likely I'm going to engage in that behavior. So now let's actually talk about what the matching law is, big picture, right? So this law basically states that the organism is going to respond relative and match the rates of reinforcement. So if we look at the example with the guy sleeping while he's studying for the midterm, right? He has all the choices to respond, but especially if you've been cramming all day, where do you think the most reinforcement is going to come from? Falling asleep, right? Let's look at the other one, right? Friendship. It's something interesting that previous to this, I didn't really think about. But if you think about how you start to talk to your friends, how much you talk to your friends, what they tell you, you start to see what the best friends tend to look like, right? Or they're the people that you frequently engage in and frequently provide reinforcement, right? So if they're frequently providing reinforcement, you're a lot more likely to distribute your time with this friend than other friends, right? And it's not mutually exclusive. You can still hang out with your others, but it just so happens that I hang out a lot more with Carlos than I do with, let's say, someone else from back home in Houston, right? Because he provides a lot more reinforcement for my behavior than they do because they're so far away. So in both examples, the like and the unlike is that the rates of reinforcement or the amount of time spent on the alternative match the rates of reinforcement. So one cool study that kind of was conducted by Peter Killeen, a big behavior analyst nowadays, is one in which they had participants, they were told that they need to come into a room and have a cool discussion about drug abuse, right? So it was a bunch of college students. So you can imagine they were excited to give their opinion on a big controversial issue, right? So then the behavior analysts hired confederates or other graduate researchers who also looked like about the same age as the students. So then the task was, even though the participant didn't know this, let's say that there was a participant here, me and Carlos would be instructed to provide reinforcement every once in a while, right? On an intermittent schedule. So whenever they make a point, I'll be like, hey man, it's a really good point. I see exactly what you're saying, right? And we would be instructed when to deliver the reinforcement. So what they ended up finding was that the participant ended up spending more time and looking at the confederate or the person, right, either me or Carlos, depending on who was providing more reinforcement. And within sessions, they would actually switch. So for the first half, I would be providing the reinforcement, right? So I'd be more likely to say, okay, wow, that's an amazing point you're saying. And then the second half, he would do that, and the participant would actually shift and start allocating the responding based on where the reinforcement was coming from. So now we're here to the end, and we're going to make some big picture ideas, right? So Remember, behavior makes sense, right? Why a person does something is not some kind of mysterious, mystical explanation. It's because it's a product of the environment behavior relations. Remember, there's always more than one schedule operating at the same time, right? And you can see this every day, right? Right now, I have tons of choices in different behaviors that I can engage in, but which one provides the most reinforcement is the one I'm likely to engage in among those alternatives. So with this concept of the matching law, you can start to understand why people spend their time and behavior in the places that they do, right? So if we start talking about someone that, just because we just talked about drug abuse, likes to consume drugs, ask yourself, where is the reinforcement coming from? One could be the thing itself, but also might have access to a community of reinforcement that they didn't have before. And you can see how it's starting to shift their behavior to where they're spending most of their time engaging in drug behaviors, right? Another one, especially because it's really relevant right now. A lot of us, we're stuck at home, right, because of these stay-at-home orders. But the idea that the government has been telling us that we need to flatten the curve, right, by engaging in that social distancing, staying 6 feet away from each other. But yet, we still have people out there partying with others, even though, their chances of getting this deadly disease increases like substantially. So why are they doing it? And again, ask yourself, what are the alternative behaviors? How much reinforcement is being provided? It's definitely a lot more fun to hang out with my friends than it is to just stay here in my apartment by myself, right? So even that behavior makes sense. So we've reached the end. So if you have any questions, again, please don't hesitate to ask us and we'll move on and see y'all in the next video.